Hello, I'm Mercedes Stephenson. Welcome to the West Block, politics, perspectives, and players. The UK is on the cusp of leaving the European Union. And for some, January 31st at 11 p.m. is the moment that they've been anticipating for years or even decades. The UK has been slowly working towards the deadline since June of 2016, when the public voted at 52% in favor of leaving the European Union. Now that we're here, what does Brexit actually look like? Professor Tim Bale, Deputy Director of UK in a Changing Europe, joins me now from London with more. Come February 1st, what do things look like in the UK?
Well, actually, they don't look so very different from the day before. We have this transition period, which lasts a year until December the 31st. And until then, I don't think most people, most men and women on the street, if you like, are going to notice any difference. The only real difference will be that in the councils of the EU and in the European Parliament, there won't be any British representation. But as far as people's everyday lives are concerned, nothing much is going to change while we negotiate our future relationship over the next year.
So those negotiations, this transition period, if you will, that's an 11-month period. What are some of the things that need to be negotiated during that time period?
Well, really the main thing is the free trade agreement or hopeful free trade agreement between the EU 27 and the UK. At the moment, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has set himself a very, very tight timetable for negotiating that. The hope, however, is that we will still manage to do not only a kind of zero tariff agreement, but something which will see the UK to some extent still align itself with EU standards and regulations in order to prevent a whole bunch of bureaucracy for our exporters and, of course, for importers into the UK. And actually, those two sets of people are often very interconnected. If you think of our car industry, for example, or our aviation industry, we very often bring in parts from the European mainland and use those to assemble the products that then leave the UK for the EU. So one of the concerns is that we don't have a great deal of dislocation. Otherwise, that kind of just-in-time manufacturing is going to fail completely.
11 months doesn't seem like very long to negotiate a trade agreement. I mean, we've seen them take years and years to do this before. Do you think that it is something that realistically can be achieved by the end of this year?
I think it's very difficult to imagine the kind of comprehensive free trade agreement that certainly some of the Brexiteers were promising during the referendum campaign happening within the next year. In fact, technically, we're supposed to have some idea of what that agreement will be by the middle of the year. Now, that looks to me almost impossible unless what the government does is negotiate some kind of quote unquote bare bones agreement with the EU that can be fleshed out afterwards. But that in itself is a problem because it leads to massive uncertainty among businesses as to the regulatory and standards procedures that they will have to follow in the months and the years to come. So it may be that Boris Johnson, whatever he has said in the Conservative manifesto at the election and indeed thereafter, will have to get some kind of extension. Whether he kind of disguises that in some way or whether he just has to come out and reverse himself on that, we've yet to see. We have to remember that we do have a prime minister that has a history of saying one thing, if you like, and then doing quite another later on when he needs to.
So what happens, though, for the UK if there's no agreement by the end of the year? You've said that they could negotiate an extension potentially. If the European Union doesn't agree to that request for an extension, what happens then?
Well, I think, to be honest, the EU is likely to agree to an extension because as far as the EU is concerned, any extension will just mean steady state. So it will mean no dislocation and no disruption. I don't think the EU's really got any interest in what some people are calling no deal 2.0. The only people who've got an interest in that really are the hardline Brexiteers who believe in a complete, as they would see it, clean break with Europe. In other words, us trading on so-called WTO terms with the EU. Now, there are very few economists and certainly very few business people who think that would be a good idea. So I expect that if the Prime Minister were to ask for an extension, the problem wouldn't actually come from the EU 27. The problem would come from some of the Conservative backbenchers behind him and some of the more, if you like, Brexiteer ideologues outside Parliament.
On this side of the Atlantic, we do hear a lot about Brexit in terms of the border and immigration. Where do you see all of that going during this transition period, and what will happen come January 1st of 2021?
Well, the government currently is committed, and I think there's a lot of public support for this, to treating EU citizens who come after this year in much the same way as they treat citizens from any other country in the world. They will therefore be subject to immigration controls, and those controls, at the moment anyway, are based largely on skill levels, and the proxy for those skill levels being some kind of salary threshold. There has been a report out this week by the government's Migration Advisory Council, which has really, to be honest, poo-pooed the government's talk of some Australian-style point system, and wants to basically maintain the kind of system we currently have for third countries. And it will simply be that EU citizens coming after 2020 will be subject to that regime. Having said that, those EU citizens who are already here or who will come during this year will have, if you like, special privileges and will be able to apply for settled status, so-called, in the EU, and will therefore in some ways be treated as permanent residents.
So in layman's terms, does that mean a closing of the border?
Yes, I mean, I think we are likely to see EU immigration into the UK drop to the kinds of levels that we see from other countries in the rest of the world. In fact, interestingly, we've already seen a decline in net migration from the EU countries as people have, if you like, in the continent of Europe, got the message that they're not particularly welcome here, particularly if they don't have a high skill level. And one of the arguments for Brexit has always been, convincingly or not, that it would actually help people on lower salaries with lower skills because they would face less competition from EU citizens coming to the UK to work.
What does that mean on an economic scale, though, for the UK? If you're going to see this kind of closure down the road, what does it mean for businesses, and how are businesses preparing for that?
Well, businesses have found it very, very difficult to prepare because they simply have not had a very good or very detailed steer from the government as to what either the immigration regime is going to look like or the product standards and regulatory environment they're going to face. If you look at economists and what they're forecasting, I don't think there really is any respected economic forecaster who is saying that this will be good for the UK, certainly in the short to medium term. Most of the forecasts indicate that there will be a drop, if you like, in GDP against trend. That doesn't necessarily mean that we'll go into recession. It simply means, according to them anyway, that we won't grow as fast as we otherwise would do were we to keep in close alignment with the EU. So many people would argue that economically it doesn't make much sense to do what we're doing. But of course, it's not all about the economics. There are kind of cultural and sovereignty factors in our decision to leave the EU. It was never all about the money.
Finally, if you're saying that come February 1st, for the next 11 months, we won't see a big difference because of Brexit, when does that change? In other words, when will the rubber hit the road for people there in the UK? And when will the impact of that separation from the EU be felt in the UK?
Well, I mean, I think if we manage to negotiate some kind of free trade agreement, even if it's a sort of minimalist one that can then be built on, I don't think that people will notice a huge difference on January the 1st, 2021. If, however, we leave without any kind of deal, the rubber really will hit the road. And in fact, the rubber will stop, if you like, on the road, because there could then be the kind of massive dislocation and disruption at ports in particular, and perhaps some shortages, certainly of manufacturing components, and possibly even of food and medicines that some people were forecasting if we had left the EU without any kind of withdrawal agreement last year. So I don't think we'll know really until the middle of the year quite how difficult things are going to be.
Mr. Bale, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.